Good evening, gentlemen. We are in the middle. We're actually getting a little bit further through. We're a little bit past the middle of the Rebbe Rashab's discourse about the unity of God. A few weeks ago, we concluded. It was in a mind-blowing fashion. It totally transformed everyone's lives down to the subatomic level. That really, the world is nothing other than a manifestation of godliness. And in fact, even to call it a manifestation is probably too strong. The world exists within its source like a ray of the sun in the sun, and all that's really here is godliness and an expression of the divine. And despite the fact that we don't see this, despite the fact that we're not familiar with this and don't experience it in our daily lives, nevertheless, this is the reality. Our reality is an expression of godliness, says the Rebbe Rashab, and nothing else. And then 2 weeks ago we began to discuss that if so, this has to transform who we are and how we live. Who we are and how we live cannot remain the same in light of this truth. On the contrary, if a person really contemplates this, and a person uses their chachma bina das, their wisdom, their understanding, and their knowledge, to internalize this truth, to internalize this divine reality, then in fact, the individual will no longer desire the superficial aspect of each reality. They won't desire the limited, finite pleasures of this world. But on the contrary, says the Rebbe Rashab, they will desire only godliness. They will get in touch with, because the truth is that once a person realizes that in an irrevocable, in an irreversible way, so to speak, when a person realizes that the aspect of the thing that they love is really secondary, they're getting the inauthentic version, they deeply desire, and they can no longer be satisfied with that version. They'll deeply desire the truth of the thing. And since, as we've learned throughout our discourse, the truth of each thing is the godly vitality that is constantly creating it, therefore, when a person encounters something in the world, a person sees a good hamburger, right? What will they desire? The person will be sickened by the inauthentic, superficial, finite, physical manifestation that is reported by their senses and their animal understanding. And on the contrary, they will desire not the physical concealment of God, self-concealment of God, which is not really real. They will desire the truth of the hamburger, which is the divine, the godliness that is within it. And they won't settle for anything less than godliness itself, than the infinite one, the Ein Sof. Last week we took a diversion. The last couple of weeks we haven't been inside the text. 2 weeks ago we got largely distracted. Last week we discussed outside the text some of the concepts we're going to be discussing now, which is about the animal soul versus the godly soul, which we explained as the biological existence of the Jew versus their divine existence, their divine vitality. That really the idea of the godly soul is there is a place within the Jew where they simply are their relationship with God. Whereas the animal and biological soul is defined by its taiva, is defined by its rotzen, is defined by its desires. And all the animal soul really is, what it means to be the human animal, is to be full of desire, which is a different way of saying that it has no self-consistent inner definition. It's defined only in terms of everything that it wants, everything that's all around it. In other words, if you dig and dig and dig to the core of what the animal soul is, what will you find? You'll find there's nothing there. Everything that it is its relationship to other things. Everything that it is its desires, is what it wants. It's defined by its lacks. It's defined by what it isn't, in a sense, by what it doesn't have, rather than what it is. Unlike the godly soul, which has a true existence, the divine vitality within the person has an existence as the very relationship with God. And that's a summary, the briefest possible summary of our classes until now, and what we've been speaking about lately. Amen. a strong drink.
See if there's more.
Better this way. Keeps you on your toes. All right. We are about halfway, a little past halfway down, page Membez. We're at the start of a parenthesis, a parenthetical statement. It's basically smack in the middle of the page. It says, Vehine. See where I am? Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Let's read. I'd like to do like a page today. That would be ideal. We'll see how that goes. Have to be ambitious, right? Aim high. All right. V'hinei. It's almost like an insult, by the way, to the mimer in a sense, because we're going to do a whole page and not get distracted by anything along the way. It's so boring that we're going to finish the whole page. In a sense. Anyway, we'll do our best. V'hinei, and behold, bittul zeba adam, this bittul, this nullification within the person. The Rebbe just finished saying that the person's entire goal, once they get in touch with this divine reality and they really internalize the fact that basically everything is only the godliness within it and there's nothing other than godliness that's really real, once a person internalizes that divine reality, then they will desire very much to fulfill their mission in life. What's the reason that we are created here on this earth? Is to return everything to its true reality, to its true source, right? God makes nothing into something, as the Yom says. Our job is to take that something and revert it back into nothing. We are here to reveal the divine truth of every aspect of reality. And we do this through nullification, through bittul, right? Which is a different way of saying we show that nothing is just an independent, separate thing from godliness. We show that everything is dependent or even non-existent within godliness. That's what we mean by nullification. We like the drop of milk that happened to have fallen into the huge pot of cholent, that despite the fact that this table is here, it amounts to nothing but godliness. And that's the goal. That's what's called bittul, nullification. We have to, by using this table for its divine purpose, we can return it to, and also through profound contemplation of its nature, we can return it to a state where there is nothing here but godliness. In other words, we seek out the truth of the thing. And this process of seeking out the truth of the thing within the human being, who bebeis madregas, occurs at two levels. Within the person, within the human being. Good evening. How come the excuses change, but the lack of attendance is consistent? This nullification within the person is at two levels. So in other words, the person is doing this to themselves, right? In other words, okay, so forget the table, right? We start first with ourselves, right? It's like you have to work from the inside out. You have to start with the things that are closest at hand, right? The Baal Shem Tov famously said, I'm not sure if it's actually in any of the real Sfarim or if this is just one of the things that people say, frankly, so don't go building any religions off this, but it's said that the Baal Shem Tov said that a person can block, the whole sun is reflected in the drop of the ocean, the same way it's reflected in the ocean, something like that. The Baal Shem Tov also said that if a person is walking and the sun is in the sky, you can block the whole sun just by moving your tiny hand, right? In other words, there's the small things that we change in our own lives can go a long way. They can accomplish the whole mission, in other words. Don't think that you have to move the sun, right? In other words, you can move your hand, you're moving your hand, your mere hand can accomplish the whole mission. You can block the sun for yourself, right, and make that your reality on a personal level. Similarly, before we go, well, not before, because the Torah has obligations, obviously, vis-a-vis the world, but in a sense, prior to the relationship where we go out into the world and we take this table and we make it part of godliness, which is its own mission, we have to start with ourselves. We have an animal soul, and as we're going to say, we have a body. And these two things, we also have to unite with godliness, nullify with their source, return to what they really are. So there's two levels within the person that have to be nullified. That the person, when they realize the reality of the divine, will want to return to that reality, or they want to bring that reality into them. Because a human being is made up of a body and an animal soul. The body is a physical being that is felt with the actual sense of touch, right? The sense of touch related to the lowest and the most inert of all things, right? Inanimate objects are what you feel with your sense of touch, and of the five senses, it is the most physicized and the coarsest is the sense of touch, the least elevated, right? The body is something you can feel with your fingers, literally. Pardon me. The metzius yesh, it's felt to be an independent reality with your fingers. In other words, you can actually feel that there's something there rather than nothing with your fingers, right, which is unique to the body. Nefesh habahames, whereas the animal soul, the biological being that we were talking about briefly in our review, hu gam ken yesh, it is also an independent reality. In other words, it's also not subsumed within godliness. It's also its own thing. It's not just a manifestation of the divine. It also appears to be its own creation. Ach ema yesh gashmi, but it is not a physical, independent reality. That you can feel with your hands. Because its very being is spirituality. And it's called independent from God. It's called a something because it is not nullified to godliness like the godly soul is, because the godly soul is batul b'metzias. The godly soul literally has no being of its own. It has no being per se. Its entire being is just the godliness which it relates to. She'en lo ratzon acher. How do we define it having no being of its own? It has no other will, kiyam elokos, other than godliness. So, what do we see here? We see here something very interesting, which is pretty logical, I think, but for some it's very counterintuitive, which is the idea that the line between something and nothing is not the line between the physical and the spiritual, right? The difference between something and nothing, in the sense that we mean something and nothing in this mimer, right? In this mimer, nothing means nothing but godliness. Something means something in additional to godliness. So in this discourse, something spiritual can be a something, just like the physical could be a something. In other words...
So we're talking about the level of bittul.
Correct. We're talking about the extent to which there's nothing here other than godliness. And of course, in Judaism, as in all monotheisms where we believe in the one God and that everything comes from the one God, the physical is no less divine, is no less godly than the spiritual per se. Why would God be more spiritual than physical, right? Now, of course, there's a sense in which we say God is more spiritual than physical because the physical is the easier thing to know that God is not, right? It's more complicated to know that God is not spiritual, right? Whereas pretty much everyone agrees that God can't be physical, the one God. But nevertheless, the fact remains that if a dichotomy comes forth from God, in other words, if God creates a thing and its opposite, if God creates black and white, love and fear, spiritual and physical, it stands to reason that God is not on one side of this divide, right? To say that God is one of the sides rather than relating to both sides, or in some sense the source of both sides, seems to say something against the unity of God, God forbid, right? It's very similar to what we were discussing earlier in our mimer, which really, if you think about it, makes this whole point moot. It makes this whole discussion quite obvious, right? Earlier in the mimer, earlier in this discourse, we were describing the difference between the divine self-revelation. Good evening. Earlier in this discourse, we were discussing the difference between God's self-revelation and God's self-concealment. Yes, this should ring a bell. We were describing how God doesn't change at all in the act of creation. Why? Because even though He's intimately involved in the act of creating each thing, nevertheless, all of His self-concealment, all change, so to speak, that godliness undergoes in the act of creating, all of those changes are nothing other than further manifestations of godliness, right? Which is really the same point. Yes, like the person playing hide and seek who says, "You can't see me now because I put my hands in front of my face, but even my hands are part of me," right? When you see my hands, you see me too, right? Similar idea. We said with godliness that godliness is not truly self-concealing, that God conceals Himself only with Himself. He hides only with further godliness, with further expressions of the Ein Sof. So to here, the distinction between spiritual and physical is in some sense similar, right? In other words, in the sense that because He truly is Ein Sof, because He truly is infinite, right? Neither one of these concealments can be anything other than godliness, right? Why would the mode of the physical be any more of a concealment or any more of a distance than the mode of the spiritual, right? All divine self-concealments are themselves divine, which is basically the same principle, in other words, as in every dichotomy, in every mode that something appears different from godliness, really the thing which appears to be ungodly is just as godly as the thing which appears godly. If you followed that expression. So, what comes out is that spirituality is not godliness. In Chassidus, spirituality is emphatically not godliness. This has many ramifications. This is actually an idea that can be said in a few words, that the full ramifications really deserve a book, maybe multiple books. This is a very profound idea, that spirituality is not godliness. One of the ramifications, for example, is that the spectrum of most spiritual on one side and most physical on the other side, that spectrum does not have any, cannot rule on what's the more godly thing to do, for example, right? In other words, if your goal is to express godliness, sometimes the right thing to do is very spiritual, sometimes the right thing to do is very physical, and there's no way of knowing just by judging, is this more physical or more spiritual? There's no way of knowing what the right course of action is to do inherently, right? Inherently. In other words, a different way of saying this is God is completely free of this dichotomy. God can choose whatever side of this dichotomy He wants. God could choose that the physical is more godly, that could be more of a manifestation of godliness. He could choose the spiritual. This whole dichotomy is really of no inherent meaning, of no inherent what's the word? It poses no inherent limitation to godliness. And so we find in this case that you have the physical body that you can touch with your hands. You have the biological vitality, the biological life force of that physical body, which you can't touch with your hands, which is spirit. We're talking about something that is spiritual. You will not find it under any microscope. We emphatically say in Chassidus that what makes the body alive is not something that a scientist will ever discover, for example. Right? It's not something you'll ever discover in a lab, right? What makes a body alive. It's a spiritual reality, even though it's not particularly a godly one, right? This way of thinking is very... a lot of what Chassidus is, to a certain extent, is this way of thinking, of the distinction between spirituality and godliness. the biological vitality of the human being is distinguished from the godly soul because it wants things other than godliness. Right? So it's a want, it's a spiritual want, it's a spiritual desire. That's what defines the animal, the biological soul of the human being. They're defined by what they lack, by what they want. And even though wanting is spiritual, you can very much want something that is not godly. And in fact, you find, by the way, this is really just a parenthetical, but you find that a lot of people who are very spiritual have a very anti-godly perspective. The two things are, in many cases, opposite, right? In other words, many are the cases of the people who wandered into the spiritual world on this drug or this experience or this thing, and they came back and they said that the real reality of this world is not right versus wrong. The real reality of this world is knowledge versus ignorance, right? Or enlightenment versus benightedness, right? In other words, they come back with their higher spiritual knowledge, and from that place they saw that all things are one, and the actions of human beings are not morally weighted, and that all moral systems are external impositions on the deep spiritual reality of the human being, which transcends all these minor things like right and wrong, right? Many are the cases, and this is a case where spirituality is literally opposed to godliness, right? In other words, the person becomes such a king, or such they gain such power, because knowledge is power. They gain such knowledge and therefore such power of spiritual matters that they think that the spiritual realm is an independent reality, independent of God, the things that they encounter in these spiritual realities are not beholden to anyone, right? That God has no say, that these things are as real as God, that they encounter, they think that they are God, right? I had a teacher in yeshiva who said that the reason people study Kabbalah and learn about all the different levels of godliness, there's only one reason, he said, right? It's so that when Mashiach comes, you'll recognize the different levels of godliness, right? Because godliness, when Mashiach comes, every level that's described in Kabbalah will become manifest and real and part of our, like the physical world is our experience now, so when Mashiach comes, all of these levels will be our experience. And he says, if we didn't learn Kabbalah, we would see Malchus of Asiya, the lowest of the lowest of the 10 spheres, within the lowest of the 10 spheres, of the lowest of the four worlds, and we would think that that was God himself. Right? If we didn't have Kabbalah, then when Mashiach came, we would think that this lowest of the lowest thing was God himself. In other words, or to put it slightly differently again, this is all by way of parenthetical.
In God we trust, money we believe.
Sorry?
In God we trust, money we believe.
Yeah,
Kind of?
that's a good way of putting it. But well, think of it this way. Judaism is not necessarily a, what's the word? It's not a spiritually austere religion. In other words, most of what we focus on is on the human being and our relationship with Hashem, right? So in other words, we don't talk a lot about, because it's really not important to what we have to do, so that's why we don't talk about it a lot. We don't talk about angels and demons and all the different spiritual realities that undoubtedly we do say exist or have existed or will exist, etc. The matter is involved, right? But the Talmud, of course, mentions all of these sorts of things. There's angels and demons and visions and manifestations and all of these spiritual realities, right? It's not that we deny that they exist, we just don't focus on them so much because it doesn't have much to do with our job, really, is the truth. Our job is to serve God alone, right? The whole point of Judaism is that In other words, what I'm trying to say is that why is the fact that there's 10,000 angels more relevant than the fact that there's 10,000 ants in your backyard, fundamentally to the service of God, right? In other words, it's not that we say that these spiritual realities don't exist, right? There's lots of spiritual realities, just like there's lots of physical realities, right? The point is that there is one God who is over all of these realities, and without this one God, none of these realities have any power. So fundamentally, what's the difference between, you have much greater and much higher creations, like the various angels at all the different levels and all the different worlds, and you have much lower creations, like a physical ant or a physical beetle, which greatly outnumber the human mind and which can inspire an awe of God. The sheer number of beetles in the world is beyond the human imagination to comprehend. Not just the number of beetles, the number of types of beetles even is probably beyond our ability to comprehend. Nevertheless, there's one God over all of them. So in other words, the point is not that there's not many spiritual realities. The question is, okay, now you've run into the spiritual reality, so now what, right? In other words, you've encountered there's a spiritual being out there, there's something other than this physical world. In a sense, I think in our generation or in recent generations, we're much more impressed with that kind of thing because the party line or the big lie, if you prefer, or the thing that most authorities now say about the world is that there's no such thing as the spirit at all, never mind all of these spiritual beings. So the person who can rebel against that, it takes a very steadfast and open-minded person to rebel against the stark materialism that the common man on the street believes in, right, and that they teach in the universities. But that doesn't mean that just because you escape that you found the highest truth, right? In other words, just it's out of the frying pan and into the fire. You rebel against what the university says that there's only matter. And then you get caught up in all sorts of spiritual distractions, which for the Jew gets in the way of their mission on earth, which is not to be distracted by all of these spiritual realities, which may very well be realities, just like physical realities. The point is to not get distracted. There's only one God over all of these things. This is a different sense in which spirituality is not godliness, right? There's lots of spiritual beings with no physical body who are very real. Nevertheless, to the Jew, and you have to keep in mind also in this conversation that back in the day when Father Abraham, when Avram Avinu was rediscovering God, it was the exact opposite today. The wisdom of his day was 100% spiritual, no physical, right? They didn't care about the physical world at all. Nowadays, there's a whole bunch of people running around who think there is no such thing as spirituality, which is a ridiculous thing for a soul to believe, but it's a different discussion for a different time. They think there's only matter. Back in Avram Avinu's day, everyone saw matter as totally worthless, right? It's all spiritual, it's all about the divine powers, which is why they were so tempted into idolatry. That's why they all became idol worshippers, right? And really, the worship of spirituality is fundamentally, in a sense, that's really what idol worship is in a certain sense. The people who bowed down to the sun weren't bowing down to it because it was a ball of fire. They were bowing down to it because of its spiritual qualities and the spiritual benefits that they felt the sun gave them. And it took an Abraham, it took an Avram to say, it doesn't make sense. There must be one God who is behind all of these spiritual powers and above them, and without whom none of them have any power. So the spiritual, that's my spiel, at least for the moment, that the spiritual is not the godly. Let's continue. How do you know, right? He says, the Rebbe says right here, he says, what's the difference between a very spiritual animal soul and the godly soul? And the Rebbe Rashab says very plainly, right? How do you know you found the godly soul and not the animal soul? The godly soul only wants God. It has no will of its own, right? Its will is God's will, and all its deepest desire is to be nothing within the divine, as it says in Tanya. That's all it wants. It doesn't want to exist. It wants to not exist within the infinitude of godliness, right? And then what it finds out is that the only way to not exist is to exist here and do God's will, right? And then once it gets down here and exists down here and it does God's will, it thinks, but this doesn't feel like I'm nothing within the divine. Let me go higher up towards godliness. And the closer it gets to godliness, the more it realizes it has to be done here. And this is a process, as Rani says, called Ratza V'Shuv, rushing and returning, which is like the spiritual heartbeat of the universe. This is the dynamic which creates, among other things, all time, change, spiritual dynamism. It's essentially the dynamic force within all things, within the universe, that generates all change, is Ratzah v'shuv, is rushing and returning, is the distinction between being close to godliness as an experience and doing God's will and not experiencing God, right? But the godly soul wants only godliness. That's all it's interested in. If you have an animal soul and it's interested in even very lofty spiritual things, which are not the same as the God of Avram, Chassidus would say you have a very spiritual animal soul, which in a sense may be a great asset, that may be a very good thing to have, but that's not the godly soul that we talk about in Chassidus. Okay, see, there's other discourses which talk about this concept that the godly soul only desires godliness. And the truth is that the infinite light of God can only rest on someone that's nullified, right? On something that has become nothing. Only if you have become nothing can you contain the infinite light of God, which is a very beautiful way of saying that nothing can hold the infinite, obviously. The whole idea of the infinite, by definition, is can't be held, right? You hold something from the outside, right? What vessel can hold something that's really infinite? Obviously, it's impossible. There's no edge, right? If you say I got around it and I can grasp it, obviously you're talking about something that's not infinite, right? So, it follows that the only vessel for holding, so to speak, the Ein Sof, the infinitude of God, is you have to become nothing, right? Instead of trying to become bigger and wrap yourself around the edges of godliness, which is impossible, because godliness is truly infinite, you have to do the opposite, right? If you become nothing, right, and only the infinite is in this place, that's the way you become a vessel for godliness. So there's a principle that the Ein Sof doesn't rest. Godliness does not dwell within anything that's not bottled to it, right? Which is a different way of saying, if you have your own limited, finite reality, right, you cannot contain godliness. And it's the deepest wish of the godly soul to become nothing. Aval, however, the animal soul, all of its will and its desire is for the lusts and the pleasures of this world. Vafilu b'taivas heter, he says in parentheses, the Rebbe says, even permitted lusts and desires of this world. In other words, it doesn't, again, you see here a similar idea, which is that the line between godly and not godly is, again, not the line necessarily between permitted and forbidden. Even if something is permitted to desire for a Jew, right? Like, let's say you don't want non-kosher food, you want kosher food. I feel like a really good kosher hamburger. I don't want a cheeseburger, God forbid. That's against God's will. I want a hamburger. But the point is that you want it separate from God, from God's desire. You want it as your own ratzon, your own desire, right? That is the issue. That's what separates the person from godliness, even though the thing they desire is permitted, right? Because really, what permitted means is that it's possible to elevate to godliness, right? In other words, that something is mutar, al pitora, right? It says in Tanya, mutar and asur, permitted and forbidden, really means, asur means tied up. The godliness within it is unfreeable. You can't fix it, right? Directly anyway. Whereas mutter, permitted, means the godliness within it is free. It's loose. If you go to it, if you approach it in the right way, you can free it. So that means the kosher hamburger, that godliness can be nullified. That godliness can be returned to nothingness, right? Can be, right? The thing is that if the person approaches in the wrong way with wanting only their own desires, they take the thing that could be free and they're locking it up. They're making it more separate from godliness. The thing that is permitted could go either way. That's the nature of the permitted. That's what we mean by mutter, is it's up to us. The realm of the mutter, the permitted, is what we take, and we take it either way, right? And as Tanya would say, the way you elevate it, the way you return it to nothingness, is you eat it only for godly purposes, right? I'm eating this food to use for energy, to do mitzvahs and to do good things. That's why I'm eating this food. But if you want it only as self-extension, you want it as the animal wants it, right? To feed your ego one way or another, right? To feed your independent being from God, to fulfill your will, fundamentally, right? Fulfill your lack. I'm lacking something, so I'm going to fill it with this burger, right? That fundamentally is not compatible with the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof, if that's how the person is wanting, the Ein Sof can't be there. If the person is wanting this burger only to use for godly purposes, the person has become nothing, the act of eating the hamburger has become nothing, the burger itself has become nothing, and Ein Sof is Sheira in this place. The Infinite One dwells in this act because it's nothing other than a pure extension of godliness. Even though from the outside they look absolutely identical to us. Right? To us, these two acts are literally indistinguishable from the outside. It's all dependent on intention. Right? From the inside, these two acts, we say, are completely different. The person who's eating the burger in the right way, you're not even seeing a person, you're seeing an extension of the Ein Sof, as we discussed earlier in our Maimer. But when the person has their own desires, that extension of the Ein Sof is totally hidden, is totally concealed. Right? It's totally not, it's totally covered over, so to speak.
I thought a good kosher hamburger is assos.
That's a mistake we won't make when Mashiach comes.
Made from a say. Kosher hamburger made from a say.
L'chein, therefore, nikra yesh in a batel elakus. The animal soul, despite being spiritual, is nevertheless an independent being that is not nullified to godliness. Pirush yesh le ratzan acher, it has another desire other than God's. The ene batel elakus mitzias mamish, and it's not nullified literally in its very mitzias. Or another way of saying this is, it maintains its own metaphysical address. You can find the soul. The soul can be defined and related to as something other than godliness alone, which the godly soul cannot. Something which is truly nullified to God has no desire other than godliness alone, and to cleave to godliness, to attach oneself to godliness. The animal soul, which has another desire, is an independent reality, which is its own thing. Right? The animal soul, by definition, is its own thing when it has other wills other than godliness. It's doing its own thing. That's why it's called Sitra Acher, the other side. Because it has a different will, B'lashon Yiddish, as a hot nor epis of vel to andere zach, it has a desire, somewhat of a desire for other things. It's not nullified, it's not nothing. It's its own thing. B'lashon Yiddish, as we would say in the Mamalashon, ich will de zach shu taiva gashmi, hare yesh le ratzon acher she'ena elikus. I want something which is a physical desire, a physical pleasure. He has a different will that's not godliness. And the infinite light of God only dwells on someone who's nullified to him. What does it mean nullified? He has no other will. Only godliness. And the animal soul receives its vitality from the hind part, from the back quarters of holiness. Commander Shadi Basar Kasfer, like someone who throws over his shoulder to his enemy. That's why it's called the other side. It's the other side that is not holiness, as is discussed in Tanya chapter 6. And of course, Tanya chapter 6, the main lesson is that there's godliness and then there's everything else, which is really the same lesson here. Right? It's godliness or it's not godliness. It's a binary system to the Alter Rebbe. In a sense, there's nothing else. Right? Either it's godliness or it's not godliness. That's how it fundamentally breaks down. Doesn't matter how spiritual it is, doesn't matter how it feels. It's either godliness or not godliness. So there's two things in the person that are independent of God. There is the body, which is literally a being you can feel with your hands, and then you have the animal soul, and then you have the animal soul, which is a spiritual vitality, a spiritual potential. It is an independent existence that has its own will, which is not godly. Right? So in other words, within the human being, you have two problems. You have the first problem, which is that I can feel it with my hands, and I know godliness I can't feel with my hands, right? So that's the body half of the problem, right? There's a tangibility, the actual physical stuff is in some sense a separation from godliness or concealment of godliness, right? To some extent, right? If you don't find a different way of relating to the body, right? There is the physical presence of the guf, which you feel with your hands, and then the other thing that you have to attach to godliness, which is not inherently one with godliness, is the animal soul, which has its own ideas, it has its own will, it has its own ratzon, it has its own things that it wants, and that's the way that it's separate. And therefore, the nullification we were discussing before, Gam ken beis madregas, has to also be in both things. In other words, we have to fix both problems. First, you have to nullify the sense of independence of the nefesh habahamis, of the animal soul, that it will not feel independent from godliness. I think this is the Amar Le.
I think the En Lomar maybe.
The En Le?
En Lomar maybe.
En Loimar, the Kamesha MS Hush Enegesh Bifnei Atzma, the Satnu Penina, L'Shem Shemaim Miskavnu. I think it's the Amar Le or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because in truth, the animal soul is not a separate vitality from godliness, just like we say that even the negative spiritual forces that are called Satan and Penina do all of their work for the sake of heaven. Right? In other words, even things which appear to have truly their own desires, right? Even the things which have desires that seem totally opposed to godliness, right? In some sense, they're not really. In some sense, they're still on the payroll. Exactly, well said. Interesting. Maybe it is the in Loimar, Ronnie. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly the meaning of this parenthesis here. We're either emphasizing. I believe it's two different negative spiritual forces, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I don't know. Pnina is a spiritual anything.
I believe so.
No, I don't know.
I've heard it before.
Okay.
I believe so. I could be mistaken. Either way, it's a parenthetical. So when it comes to the Rebbe Rashab's parentheticals, I'm not too ashamed to say I don't know because Penina.
Like a girl's name.
I'm not sure of what we're saying. Either we're saying that the animal soul is either we're emphasizing that the animal soul is still on the payroll despite having its own desires, as Kiel would say, or the opposite. We're saying that we can't be satisfied with the fact that even though it has its own desires, it's still on the payroll. But on the contrary, we have to nullify it in its very existence to Ein Sof, that it should have no other desire. Makatuv?
אמר רבי לוי, שטן שקטרג על איוב, ופנינה שהציקה לחנה, אמו של שמואל הנביא, לשם שמיים התכוונו. שטן כיוון דחזיה עד הקדוש ברוך הוא.
Like I said, different negative spiritual force. So here's examples, right? Like I said, it's from the Talmud, right? You have the Talmud. The Talmud talks about in Baba Basra of all things. So even the people who want to only learn civil law and turn the Torah into the U.S. Constitution, lahavdil, even they have to deal with this. I was once speaking to someone who's whatever. It's a long story. He considers himself a big philosopher of the Torah, and I said, "But how do you explain the stories about demons in the Talmud?" He says the Talmud doesn't talk about any demons. I said, "Okay, if you say so." That's
There's a lot of demons in the Talmud.
No kidding.
All the time.
There was a whole menagerie. So I don't know. I'm sure there's some profound explaining away of the simple and obvious. I don't have any problem with it, but apparently some do. Anyway, it's a.
Shimon like the Talmud.
Sorry?
That's why Shimon likes the Talmud.
Exactly right.
Shimon loves it.
Loves it, can't leave it.
The stories of the Talmud, if you learn, there's a book called Ein Yaakov, which was compiled by the Mahari ibn Habib, who was one of the great halachists and one of the great Rishonim, great rabbis. When you learn smicha, you learn a lot of different things from him. So he compiled a book called Ein Yaakov. Ein Yaakov is an incredible sefer. Ein Yaakov is the Talmud, but minus all of the halacha. Right? So in other words, all that's left is the stories of the Talmud and the moral teachings and the things like that. And Ein Yaakov is the basis of all of the Kabbalah and all of the spiritual things that are in Judaism are all found within the Talmud. In other words, it's not a bifurcation like people like to say, that the Talmud is very practical and the Kabbalah is all up in the clouds. The Talmud is very strange. There's lots of very, very strange things in the Talmud. And for some reason, when Ravina and Rav Ashi were putting the Talmud together, they thought these things were important to put in. Whereas the modern geniuses, they think it's important to take these things out and study only the law. So, I don't know. I side with Ravina and Rav Ashi. That's my opinion. But, it's, again, a discussion for a different time. It's not
so what are you saying, that the Talmud is actually a point of view?
The Talmud is full of spiritual wisdom, of course. In other words, the Talmud is not just a book of laws. The Talmud is full of spiritual wisdom. It's in between all of the laws, right? As part of all, sometimes literally in the same discussion, by the way. Sometimes the law and the stories blend together, and it becomes not so clear even where one ends and one begins. But the idea that the Talmud is a so to speak, like a dry legal discussion. Even the legal discussions aren't dry, chas v'shalom, God forbid. But the idea that the Talmud is purely a legal discussion is a caricature of the actual learning of the Talmud. If you actually read and learn the Talmud, you'll see that it's not like that at all. On the contrary, the Talmud is full and rich with deep and profound spiritual wisdom and all sorts of things that are not easily explained according to the worldview of an East Cobb homeowner, which is a terrible worldview to have. I don't recommend it. So, where were we? You cannot settle, I think is what the Maimar is saying. You can't say, in other words, it's 100% true that even though the animal soul has all its own plans and it wants to go off and eat cheeseburgers or hamburgers or do whatever its plans are, right? And even though it has its own will, it's 100% true and simultaneously that of course it can't do anything that's really, really against the will of God. In other words, there's a profound idea in Chassidus, and of course you have to be very careful when you speak about these ideas because they're very easy to, God forbid, misinterpret. But there is certainly a concept that if a person has done something that's a sin, that's a transgression, that's against the will of Hashem, nevertheless, they were in some sense meant to have done this. In other words, there's nothing that's real that wasn't meant to be in some sense. In some sense, everything that has taken place exactly as it was meant to by the plan of Hashem, right? Mitzad Hasheni, on the other hand, of course, a person can't use this, would be a fool to use this as a justification for the transgression beforehand, right? Be very careful when you understand these things. In other words, you can't say, I'm going to eat a cheeseburger because once I've eaten the cheeseburger, it will have been that was God's perfect will, and therefore it's all okay. That's not how it works. Because there's a thing called Bechira Chavshus. The person has free choice. This is one of the great mysteries of God, of course, that the person has free choice to make the decision, right? Nevertheless, either way they make their decision, it is impossible that they actually break God's true will and overarching will for all of the creation. In other words, there is a sense in which, and we see this in the concept of tshuva, in the sense of repentance, right? Where true repentance takes all of the negativity that was in the transgression and uses it as motivation and transforms it into godliness, right? So there is a sense in which everything is rectifiable. In other words, there's no such thing, God forbid, in Judaism, and really you see this in the attitude of Chassidus towards the world, there's no such thing as like this is totally outside the bounds, right? Like you've broken God's creation. You're on the lam. It's not like God has this little spotlight where all the goody two-shoes are, right? And then if you really misbehave, you've somehow gone way outside of God's purview. Like God is way over there and I'm way over here. You can't break free. You can't escape. Not even your Averis will save you, right? In other words, it doesn't matter where you run. It doesn't matter how many transgressions you do.
No matter where you go, even in the grave.
Exactly. God is there. He's there where you run to, just like He was where you started from, right? It's all within the plan. But what the Rebbe Rashab is saying is that you can't settle for, when we talk about the need to be mevatel, to nullify the animal soul, to return the animal soul to godliness, right? To bring godliness within the animal soul, you can't rest on your laurels and say that really everything I do is godliness. That's not what we mean, although that's also true. In a sense, right, as we say, even Satan and Penina, even the most negative spiritual forces, which are far more negative than the Jew themselves who's doing the sin, God forbid, right? They're created as oppositional forces. They're created as things that are davka out to go against God's will, right? Which I don't think we say about even the worst Jewish sinner. We wouldn't say that we wouldn't assume that they intentionally do what they're doing just to go against God's will, right? Even the things that God creates to go against His will, that itself is His will, right? So in some sense, you could say that by a kal v'chomer, all the more so by the animal soul. Nevertheless, right, that's not what our mission is. Our mission is not to sit back and say, well, I can't really break it. I can't really break the system, so everything must be okay. On the contrary, you have to take the animal soul and make it batel b'metzias. You have to make it that in a revealed way, it has no will of its own. It's only an extension of the Ein Sof. That it should want nothing other than godliness. Really, that's man's mission on earth, right? Someone once asked the Alter Rebbe, what is Chassidus, right? And the Alter Rebbe said in one line, what is Chassidus? L'shanos teva midosav, I believe is the answer. To change the nature of one's emotive qualities, which is a different way of saying the entire purpose of Chassidus is to ultimately, and this is a very, very lofty goal, is to transform the animal soul so that just like before you learn Chassidus, it desires its own desires, it can learn to desire only God, just like the godly soul. That's the core of Chassidus in the language of the Alter Rebbe. That it should have no other will except godliness. Except for godliness. That it should be disgusted by evil, absolutely. Sinura, as it says in Eyavei Hashem Sinura, as we say in Tehillim, which is in, I believe, Kabbalah Shabbos, right? Eyavei Hashem Sinura. Those who love Hashem hate evil, right? Which is just another... Nowadays, people say that hatred itself is fundamentally negative, right? So I guess you have to go explain that to David HaMelech, because David HaMelech said, Eyavei Hashem Sinura. People who love God hate evil. There's a form of hatred in some sense. Again, you can't go using this as justification for everything you want to do that's against the purpose, right? But there is a form of holy hatred, apparently, right? Eyavei Hashem Sinura. Really, it's the truth with everything. Every love comes with a concomitant hatred. If you understand hatred not in the ugly sense in which it's commonly used, but in the sense of when you move closer to somewhere, you naturally move further away from somewhere else. And that's really what Tehillim is talking about. When you move closer towards godliness, you're moving further away from evil. Eyavei Hashem Sinura, people who are drawn closer to godliness, right? Just naturally, they grow further away from, more distanced from, the things that God doesn't like, which is what we call wickedness, evil. And not just evil, but the animal soul can be taught to despise everything that is from the Sitra Achra, right? Which again is not just evil, it's even eating a hamburger for the wrong reason. Right? Everything between evil and eating the hamburger for the wrong reason, the animal soul can be trained and can be transformed and can be educated that these things it doesn't want, it only wants godliness. Pirush, heinen kol advar magashmi mutarim mashi yizbar shekol davar gashmi afil davar kal yesh le'sheresh be'chalas sitra achra. The desires of the animal soul for that hamburger, all permitted physical things, as will be explained. All physical things, even something even the very minor thing, has a root in the chambers of the Sitra Achra, of the opposite side from godliness, as will be explained. Yisma'isa b'tachlis, and the person will grow to hate it absolutely. I've hated it with the utmost hatred. And for all of this, see chapter 6 of Tanya. That a person, that the ultimate goal is that the animal soul should become nullified to godliness, to cleave to it, and to take pleasure in godliness. Another concept foreign to many, right? That godliness is meant to be a source of pleasure, of self-satisfaction, right? To enjoy, to take pleasure, to take self-satisfaction in godliness itself, with ava rabba, with great love, ava b'tanugim, and the love of delights, which are these different levels of love, are also discussed in Tanya. And that's what it means, that the animal soul should become batul b'metzias, that it should no longer have any metaphysical address, that it should be totally one with godliness, that it has no will or pleasure other than the will and the pleasure to take pleasure in godliness. And that is the bittul of the nefesh habahamis. This is the description of the nullification of the animal soul, right? So we started out by saying that you have the animal soul in the body. So this is the animal soul. The nullification of the animal soul is the project that we are involved in our own small way, just by learning this in our class, right? Is our one step in this project, right? Is this broader project of transforming the animal soul, that its desires should be only for godliness and its pleasure should be only in godliness. Next class, God willing, we'll discuss the guf, the physical body, which is the second form of the second thing on the person's agenda. The second part of the person's mission on earth, within themselves anyway, is not just to transform the animal soul, which is spiritual, but also to nullify the body, as we'll discuss, God willing, next week.